Hello, I'm Katherine Delbridge, Director of Government and Strategic Relations at CropLife Australia. It's been 5 weeks on the campaign trail so far, and just 1 week to go until polling day, when the nation will decide whether to return the coalition to a fourth term in government or make Anthony Albanese the next Prime Minister of Australia. Labor are ahead in the polls, with some suggesting they could win as many as 80 seats in the lower house, giving them a comfortable majority, passing that magic number of 76 seats. But as we learnt in 2019, polling isn't always a reliable indicator. Throw in the chaos being caused by some teal independents in traditionally safe Liberal seats, and I'd say we're in for a fun night come May 21st. This week, I caught up with some political insiders, John Brenton, a principal at TG Public Affairs, and Ryan Liddell, a director of Principal Advisory. We chatted about how the campaigns have been going for both the government and the opposition, and touched on what the next government could mean for our industry. Here are those chats. John, thanks so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, Katherine.
So it's been a long campaign, but we've still got a week to go. What do you think have been the key issues that have been impacting voter decisions?
Well, it's a great question, and there's two answers to that. There's the headline figures or issues that seem to be playing out nationally, and then there's the issues that are really playing out depending on where you live in the country, and there's a bit of a difference between the two. So let me start with the first. Clearly, cost of living is shown in the polling as the number one issue of all voters at this election. In fact, we only have to look at the interest rate rise that occurred last week to see that Morrison and the government's polling numbers have gone backwards since. And of course, if you have an average mortgage, which they say $600,000, it added $75 to your monthly repayment, more than wiping out potential gains you would get from the fuel excise relief and the other cost of living measures in the budget handed down just before the election. So I think number one would be cost of living. But of course, if you're in some of these inner city electorates with a bit of a higher wealth level, cost of living is not a great concern to you. When you're earning, more than $150,000 a year, or you've got a couple, both of you earning that, $65, $70, even $100 a month on your mortgage isn't really going to change your vote. And what we're seeing there is climate change and the Corruption Commission play out as two key issues in those electorates. And plus you have the rise of the teal independents or the climate 200, depending on what you want to call them. And those issues seem to be really playing out quite strongly in these electorates and clearly driving voter sentiment away from the Morrison government. Perhaps not potentially to Labor, but certainly to independents in the parliament. Whether they'll be successful enough to unseat some of those sitting members we'll only have time to tell on the 21st of May.
So I'll touch on that then with these so-called teal independents, as you've mentioned. With the possibility of a hung parliament, do you think that's realistic? But also, if there are 2 or even 3 independents elected into the House of Representatives, what does that do for the next government's legislative agenda?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll point you to the YouGov polling that was released this morning that shows the Labor Party's on track to win 80 seats in the House of Representatives. You need 76 for a clear majority. So clearly, if the election was held today and those polls were accurate, Labor would actually form majority government. I think most people think that's unlikely. And as you pointed out, what's more likely is potentially the government losing 4 or 5 seats and Labor picking up 4 or 5. That would put them on 72, 73, both of them, meaning they'd need the support of 4 independents to form government. Clearly, the teal independents are running on a pro-climate change, pro-integrity commission agenda. That means that they would naturally lean towards the Labor Party, you would have thought, on those 2 issues, given Labor's stance on them. But of course, they're running in traditional Liberal electorates. So supporting the Labor Party minority government on those 2 issues would mean not supporting their traditional voter base, which would be the Liberals who have been dissatisfied. So I think whilst a lot of people and a lot of commentators in the press are saying, well, if in a minority government situation, clearly Labor are going to form government and that's the likely outcome, I'm not so sure. I don't think you should bank on that. And I think some of the other things that are forgotten are there already are independents in the parliament. We have Bob Katter in the seat of Kennedy. He's absolutely going to support the Morrison government. You have Rebecca Sharkey in South Australia. She will support the Morrison government. So Morrison can count on at least one or two other independents, non-Peel independents, to try and form government post the election. So while the road for him to do so on paper seems tough, there is certainly an avenue that if both parties don't get to a clear majority where he could still persuade one or two of them, of the Teals, to support him and get over the line.
So looking at Scott Morrison himself then, obviously his personal approval has dropped over his last term of government. Barnaby Joyce, when he was questioned about that at the National Press Club, said it doesn't matter if people like the Prime Minister, it only matters if they trust him to do his job, to get the job done. So does the personal approval rating of the PM hurt their chances of going to another victory, another coalition victory, or is it just sort of par for the course of being a politician?
Absolutely not. Absolutely hurts their path to victory. In the last 3 federal elections, the party who had the preferred Prime Minister, who was higher, who had the preferred Prime Minister in the polling, won. So the two-party preferred vote in the last election example, Bill Shorten's election, absolutely showed Labor with a clear, path to victory. But Shorten was never even close to Morrison on preferred Prime Minister. And lo and behold, Morrison won that election. If you look at the numbers today, Morrison's polling somewhere in the mid to high 20s with women. So, of 2 in every 10 women support him and 8 in every 10 do not. These are catastrophic numbers for a Prime Minister in terms of 50% of the population. But even his vote amongst men has fallen dramatically as well. At the last election, he was in 44% of men approved of him. That's now down into the 36-37% range amongst male voters. So it's a complete collapse in support for the Prime Minister. I think largely on the back of, some personal gaffes and clearly some issues around his response to certain crises, putting your politics aside, whether you like it or not. I think Labor have been very effective at highlighting those personality traits and what Labor are saying are key flaws in his leadership style. And then you've had all the issues played in the parliament related to Brittany Higgins and Grace Tame and women's issues. And, a lot of people, I think, believe this Prime Minister's out of touch and it's a drag on the vote around the country. And how do we know that? Because all of the Liberals who are moderates in the inner city seats are asking Morrison to stay away from their campaign. They don't want him in their electorates. They don't have billboards of him up. They're distancing themselves from their own re-election prospects. And that tells you their polling is showing that he's a net negative for the party.
A little closer to home then for CropLife, our member companies work in agricultural science. What does a re-elected coalition government mean for those sectors?
It's a great question. As your members would know, agricultural science doesn't normally get much of a play in election campaigns, so you wouldn't exactly call it the issue of the moment, particularly for a coalition government. However, the Nationals Party and David Littleproud, the minister, they obviously have a lot of influence in a coalition government. What I think your members should expect is more grant programs. The coalition government seems to be absolutely wedded to these grant programs, whether it be the modern manufacturing initiatives or other such initiatives. And so if you've got a good idea, you can apply for these grants and they'll support research that way. Do I see a re-elected Morrison government channeling lots more money into CSIRO or into agricultural science more broadly? I think not. I think beyond the announcements that Littleproud has already made, I know there was $40.58 million for the Future Drought Fund and those sorts of policies. I don't think you're going to see a massive increase here. I think potentially you could if the sector got together and started to speak to the Nationals and got a few on side and began to talk about how agricultural science and some of the work that occurs in the sector could reduce emissions, could increase productivity, grow exports. I think it's a debate that hasn't been prosecuted probably very well by the agricultural science sector with the conservative side of politics. So I think there's plenty of opportunity there, but it's opportunity that'll have to be sought by your members rather than handed to them under a coalition government.
A couple more questions for you, John. There's been some funny moments on the trail, as there always is, a few gaffes and that kind of thing. But is there one key moment that the coalition would take back or change if they had their time again?
It's such a good question. And the answer to that is a bit like the answer to the first question you asked. It depends who you ask. I'd say as a whole, if you were to ask most of the government privately, they would say Morrison's stance on LGBTQ issues and transgender and the issues playing out with the candidate for Warringah, they would take that back and not have any of that debate play out in the media. I note that Morrison doubled down on it today, which is, on Thursday, sort of 8 days before the election. That's a clear sign that he feels that these issues play well in regional and remote areas that he's targeting. But it is absolutely him throwing Josh Frydenberg and Tim Wilson and Trent Zimmerman and even David Sharma under a bus in their electorates, and there'll be a bit of backlash to it. So I think the party as a whole would take that back, but of course Morrison is doubling down on it. So, pretty interesting to see it play out. Some of the insiders we've been talking to are saying Morrison thinks the election's done. He's got pretty strong religious convictions here, and he would rather see a swing to the right in the Liberal Party post-election, even if it means in opposition, and that means losing a few of the moderates. And that clearly seems to be what's playing out.
So finally then, 10 days to go, or just over a week, what does that last week look like for the coalition on the campaign trail?
For the coalition on the campaign trail, Morrison is going to keep doing what he's done. He's going to fly around the country. I know he is flying everywhere at the minute. He's gone from New South Wales to Queensland to Perth to Tasmania. He will visit every marginal electorate he possibly can. He'll continue to announce these small grants and these small initiatives that some people are saying, for example, in the seat of Bass in Tasmania, he announced a new distillery, $4.3 million. Why is the federal government building distilleries? But he believes these targeted small announcements rather than big policy ideas, helping those local candidates on the ground, will help pull back votes. I think your members will be interested that in the 2019 election against Bill Shorten, when I think it was Bob Hawke who passed away and the Labor campaign stopped for the last 2 days and Shorten went back to Melbourne and went to Hawke's pub. The Prime Minister continued to fly around. He went down to Bass and he handed out cards on voting morning of the election down in Bass, while the member Bridget Archett won the seat by 79 votes. So Morrison will campaign to the very last hour and the very last minute in these marginal electorates to try and help his candidates get across the line.
Thanks, John, for your insights. Really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Thanks very much for joining me, Ryan.
G'day, Katherine.
So we're just about 1 week out from the final polling day, and similar to the 2019 election, Labor is ahead in the polls, well ahead in the polls, to set to win potentially as many as 80 seats. What has the ALP done differently this campaign to ensure that there's not a similar defeat that happened in 2019?
Well, from the get-go, quite obviously, it's a much smaller agenda. They've the party's worked very hard to really focus on specific issues rather than sort of offer a sort of a broad sort of agenda. And there's obviously a strategic reason for that. The review from the 2019 election sort of talked about the fact the party tried to do too much. And speaking very politically, that meant that it made sort of too many enemies along the way, and made themselves the focus of the entire campaign. So, whereas this time the party's been quite effective insofar as doing their best to make Scott Morrison the focus of the campaign. Last time, if you cast your mind back to 2019, the Prime Minister had been in the job for 6 months, about 6 months before the election was called. And so the party had a real difficulty sort of trying to characterise him in a way that they could negatively portray him to win the election. Whereas this time, if you think about the sort of commentary you're seeing in the media and the polls, it's probably fair to say that a lot of the Australian public have a certain picture in their mind about Scott Morrison, and the Labor Party is certainly sort of playing on that. So they're doing their best to keep their focus on Scott Morrison. I suspect you'll see a lot of that in the last week.
So there's estimates that suggest around 2 million eligible voters will have already voted come the 21st of May.
Yeah.
Is that a good sign for the opposition that people are ready for change?
Well, the party certainly thinks so. Like internally, Labor Party, they think that, this idea that people are sort of jumping at the gates or bolting out of the gates on the day that pre-poll opens means that, there might be a bit of a tidal wave of negativity, or as some commentators like to call it, people waiting with baseball bats for the government. But I don't know. I think there's 1,000 sort of theories about this. I was talking to an MP the other day, and their big theory was in a 2-week sort of period of early voting. The first week is usually a lot of pensioners and older sort of people, and the second week is a lot of sort of younger people, which is why some of the polls you saw, some of the smaller exit polls that you saw, last week showed a significant swing towards the Liberal Party, which was counterintuitive to some of the polls that sort of show a larger swing to the Labor Party. So, I mean, the most recent experience is, I live in Adelaide, the most recent experience with early sort of polling was the South Australian election a couple of months ago. And I remember in the first couple of days, they literally had, some polling booths had like 10 or 20 people through the whole day. There was no one around. That sort of gradually sort of ramped up, and then you saw the result, as we know, where Peter Malinauskas won and knocked the Liberal sort of government out. So I think there are sort of 1,000 sort of ways you can sort of slice and dice this, but I wouldn't sort of draw too much comfort from it necessarily if I was the Labor Party.
So the media, I think a lot of the media coverage that last week has been dominated by the rise of the independents, or the so-called fuel independents. Obviously, the seats that the independents are really fighting in are largely coalition-held seats. Right. But what does the rise of independents mean for major parties in general?
I think it's a bit of a manifestation of something we've been seeing for a long time. This whole sort of the decline in the overall sort of primary vote for the two major parties, particularly the Labor Party. And in those particular seats that you're talking about, your seats like Kooyong, Goldstein, and Wentworth and North Sydney, etc. in Sydney, it's a real sort of a manifestation, if you like, of the failure of the Liberal Party to deal with three main issues: climate change, integrity in government, and a focus on women's issues. And people are like, if you think about the demographics of those sorts of seats. It's obviously self-evident that those are the sorts of issues that sometimes might drive people's votes. Some of the feedback I'm hearing from people on polling booths in places like Kooyong from the Liberal Party is that people sort of come up to Josh Frydenberg, for example, and they might say, I'm a lifelong Liberal voter. I really like you, Josh, but I just can't bring myself to vote for you this time because of your prime pushing your boss, but also because of what's happening in these issues. So I think that's really interesting. The other interesting thing I think is, while it's a failure of the Liberal Party on those particular issues, it's also a bit of a failure, in my view, on the Labor Party to not be able to capitalise on that protest vote. Obviously those sort of seats aren't necessarily seats that would ordinarily be in the hands of the Labor Party, but there's been some recent examples where, you can sort of flip that. And you can appeal, from the Labor Party's point of view, you can appeal to those sort of electorates. There might be a few sort of surprises on election night where, for example, say North Sydney, if the Labor Party finishes second in that seat and the preferences from the independents flow through, there's an outside chance the Labor Party could pick up a seat like that. So these are the sorts of things I think you'll sort of start to see sort of play out.
So thinking a little bit more closer to home for us here at CropLife, our members work across the agricultural science sector. What would an elected Labor government mean for agriculture and science, for those sectors?
I think it's a really good question, Katherine, and three main points. Firstly, overall, I think it'd be in a hypothetical sort of Labor government. I think the willingness to listen and engage would be very strong. I think the second point I make is that there's a real focus on science within the party, and you look at that with climate change, net zero, other sorts of issues that the party relies heavily on science in order to sort of justify its policy positions and political positions that it takes on particular issues. And thirdly, the party is very conscious of the fact that it doesn't have as strong a representation in regional areas that it should. It's very sensitive to this idea that it's, from some elements within the media and commentary, that it's kind of beholden to inner city sort of issues, very conscious of that. So I think you'll find in a world where the Labor Party does win government, there'll be a sort of a renewed focus on regional areas. And part of that will be, there won't be a sort of not wanting to sort of predict results, because that's obviously quite fraught given recent history. But part of that will be, in a world where the Labor Party doesn't win it doesn't have a lot of representation in the bush, so to speak, in regional areas. There'll be, senators will be appointed sort of duty senators for electorates that are non-held electorates. And that's happened in the past as well, but there'll be a real focus on, driving senators to get out to those areas, spend time in the community, meet with, local growers, local associations, local community leaders and stuff like that on the issues that really sort of affect the bush and regional areas, and bring that back to, to Canberra and to the leadership as well. So I think that's that's a really sort of positive thing.
There's been a few gotcha moments, particularly in questions from the media, but is there one key moment across Labor's campaign that you think that they would change or take back if they could have their time again?
Yeah, I think so. I think their first day was pretty bad. I think you'll probably recall Anthony being asked about the unemployment rate and the cash rate, and that was really difficult. And I think that was a real sort of it was a real wake-up call about the difference between operating as an opposition during the usual political cycle and then when the campaign happens. I can tell you it's basically like the best comparison, I think, is basically like it's like a football World Cup. So there's a qualifying and that's all very nice. Then you get to quarterfinals and it just ratchets it up a lot. And it's like, from my experience in 2016 and 2019, I can tell you sort of go from on the Saturday doing a press conference in the park where you're begging journalists to come along to send a camera, to Sunday, all of a sudden you've got 7 cameras and 25 journalists, and all being quite aggressive and ferocious because A, they want to get their question up, but B, I think it's probably fair to say that politics these days means that, journalists want to sort of sometimes want to be part of the story. Sometimes you see more cameras pointing the other direction towards journalists than you do at the politicians. But I know that, back to your question, Katherine, I know that, Anthony and the party were quite, there was a real sort of jolt on the first day, and it was sort of hit them like a bit of a truck, so to speak. And they learnt from that. And they really sort of stepped back and thought, hang on, we need to sort of rethink the way we're doing things. And that included ensuring that, he was briefed in a way that meant that wouldn't sort of necessarily happen again. And I think, and to their credit, they've kind of turned it around, insofar as, a week's a very long time in a campaign, let alone a couple of days. That seems like a very long time ago now, even though it was only sort of, 4 or 5 weeks. So to their credit, they've flipped it. They've put the attention back on, to the Prime Minister, and that's exactly sort of where they want it.
You mentioned earlier that you think Scott Morrison will be a pretty big focus, or the character of Scott Morrison will be a big focus of Labor's last week. Where they're headed to, and what does that last week look like?
I guess the trick to the last week is to sort of try and keep the big momentum all the way through. And I think you'll find, obviously yesterday on Sunday, we saw a fairly large sort of launch for the Liberal Party, and, Labor Party sort of trying to match that as well. So that's trying to sort of grab the agenda and sort of drive through the week. I think this is a sort of time in the campaign where both parties really sort of start to sort of sit down and look at the seats that they're kind of going to give up on. If they're, losing those sort of seats, the ones they're going to give up on, the ones they need to sort of sandbag, so the ones they need to bring resources in from other seats to sort of try and save those seats. And then, if parties one particular party might be feeling particularly sort of buoyant or optimistic, the sort of, snatch and grab seats they might sort of take, seats like, Bennelong in Sydney, for example, for the Labor Party. So there's that real sort of like that cold assessment that will inform a lot of what happens during last week. I can tell you that, from if a party's are going well and it looks like they're going to be in the best possible position, you'll be getting phone calls from every person under the sun with all sorts of harebrained ideas about things that you should be doing and shouldn't be doing, and so everyone can have their little stamp on the win. And for parties that aren't doing particularly well, or might be the underdog, sort of certainly the last week, you'll start to see things like wheels falling off and candidates doing rogue things, or even you saw in the last couple of weeks Josh Frydenberg going out of his way to distance himself from the Prime Minister. You'll probably see a lot of bit of that, given how he's sort of perceived the electorate. So it'll be interesting to see how it sort of plays out. But the real key is that keeping that momentum all the way through to election day. So when people sort of wake up on Saturday morning, it's like they've got in the back of their head who they're going to vote for when they go into those sort of polling booths.
Thanks so much, Ryan, for your time and your insights. We appreciate it.
No worries, Katherine. Thanks very much.